Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, and he has been an inspiration to me, and his work is, I think, extremely important for young people who would like to understand the future and like to understand the principles of physical economics. So welcome, Richard Freeman.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'm very happy to be here and to hopefully meet all of you. I'll just say at the outset that if people do have questions, definitely, we'll take them up. And I know we sent out two pieces. One was on the Mr. LaRouche's, one was on the actual, a paper that he wrote, Trade Without Currency, which is a challenge. But if you didn't get a chance to read it before this, then fine. Daniel will give you my email and you can send me questions afterwards. And likewise for the paper on Roosevelt's Bretton Woods. So let me just start. What I would say is that the intersecting existential crisis of the simultaneous accelerated meltdown of the world financial system, which is at the point of no return, accompanied by huge economic decline, and the British, US, European Union, NATO drive to launch intercontinental nuclear war, which can end mankind as a species, makes obvious the need to institute the most radical change of this century, put the rotted out world financial system through bankruptcy reorganization, and create a new Bretton Woods credit system for anti-entropic development. Since July of this year, the Schiller Institute has posted on its website a petition written by Schiller Institute chairwoman Helga LaRouche entitled Call for an Ad Hoc Committee for a New Bretton Woods System, which presents 8 critical points for implementation to launch such a system. Much of the war push is driven by the collapse of the financial system. That may not seem evident to everyone immediately. We're going to see why that is. If we can solve both at one time, which is the only way you can do it, you can't solve one problem and put the other one on the shelf and wait for it to be solved. You have to solve everything at the same time of substance. You can fix your car's flat tire, but you're not going to change the world system by just going one at a time. Now, the British-US NATO war in Ukraine is driven by the British oligarchies and American and NATO allies fear that the world financial system, loaded with derivative debt, speculation, and Shaktian fascist policies against their own population, is disintegrating at a faster rate than they can control. That dying, looting system is the source of their wealth and gives them the power to dominate. They will do anything increasingly insane and irrational to preserve that system. Ukraine and confrontations over Taiwan are merely pretexts to realize century-old policies to dismember and break up Russia and China, and to stop a Russia-China-India alliance along with developing nations to initiate an alternative nascent world credit system. The danger is evident. Russia has 5,977 nuclear warheads, while the United States has 5,428, according to the Federation of American Scientists. Once a nuclear engagement is begun, even accidentally, there is no such thing as limited nuclear war. As expert Ted Postel has made known, the 100 million degrees Kelvin nuclear fireball shockwave, and that's what happens. You drop a nuclear bomb, you don't drop it directly, it actually creates a shockwave above the ground first. And it's about 100 million degrees Kelvin, about 5 times the hottest spot on the sun. This would be just simply from a detonation of an 800 kiloton nuclear bomb, will turn cement into dust and incinerate population centers around the world. Those who survive will experience a slower but even more painful death. We cannot allow that to happen. Tonight, we're going to look at the alternative, the first Bretton Woods system, which was set up by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, and the new Bretton Woods system, drawing from Roosevelt, but based upon higher principles of Lyndon LaRouche. First, to set that up, we examined the fireball shockwave of the City of London Wall Street control system and what is meant by physical economic growth. With that foundation, we're then going to look at the Bretton Woods, those two Bretton Woods systems. So the first, what I would like to do is just state what's been happening. 3 weeks ago, on September 22nd, the European Central Bank, which is like the Federal Reserve of the United States, but it's the central bank for Europe, they have a risk monitoring facility. It's called the European Systemic Risk Board. They issued their first ever, quote, general warning that the financial system of Europe, quote, faces systemic risk that can cause the entire system's failure. Now, you have to remember, if you're a central banker, number one, you're an idiot. But number two, you learn how to speak in a certain very measured, if there's a fire in the room, you say, I believe the gradient of heat is rising slightly in this room. So if they're putting out a risk management statement saying, quote, that the systemic risk could cause the system's failure, that means it's much farther beyond even what they're willing to admit to us at this point. And then on October 4th, just a few days ago, the London Economist, which is the mouthpiece for the City of London and the British oligarchy, published a story, and the title of the story is Financial Markets Are in Trouble. And then it reports, it is hard not to feel a sense of foreboding, end quote. Then it continued that the dislocation of the financial markets could lead to catastrophic, this is a quote, catastrophic pain when financial institutions fail. Now they would know. And then more recently, you may have seen a very huge crisis in Britain, although it's not generally reported in the nightly news or even on the blogosphere. And that is that when Liz Truss, who's the new Prime Minister of Britain, said that she was going to do a 45% tax cut to the wealthiest part of the population in Britain. And then what happened was the bond markets in Britain, they're called the gilt markets, collapsed because people were totally fearful that you couldn't finance the budget. I mean, that's not the real reason, but it was a triggering incident. And then on the September 27th, you had a meltdown, literally, of both the bond market, the pension funds which have invested in the bond market, and derivatives which are based upon those two. We'll get to what the derivative is, but when you have derivatives, and there's about 900 trillion in the world, just short of 1 quadrillion, and if even 50 trillion of those go, even 25, then the whole system will melt down. So why is this happening? And you may have seen as well in Germany, the physical economy is contracting. The energy price in Europe has risen by 12 times this year, not 12%, 12 times this year. Why all these failures? It's because the system is corrupt. So if I could have the first slide, please. And that's just going to be a picture of someone. Okay, that's on the left, Roosevelt in 1937, and on the right, at least my right, but probably more on the left, is Lyndon LaRouche, who we're going to be speaking about. Next, please. Okay, now some of you may have seen this. The next one, please. Yeah. And this is called the typical collapse function. And what it does is it's a representation, you might call it the heuristic device, which shows 3 curves, which are interacting with one another. The one that says financial aggregates, we're going to look at this point. And that has been rising, increasing. You will look at the physical economic input-output, and that is decreasing. And the third curve, which is the green one in between, called monetary aggregates, what that shows is normally you have monetary aggregates, those your currency supply, what you might call M1 or M3. But what's happened is they are now increasing to try and bail out the financial aggregates. And if you look at that circle, that's a point of discontinuity. That means that the financial money pumping is accelerated without control because you can't do enough money pumping to hold up the financial aggregates. Now, that's a point that we are at right now. But I'd like to then show you with something that I constructed to show you this representation in the United States. I do want to mention one thing. In 1979, the problems which we will see is the financial system after President Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve system in 1971. The system became a floating floating rate system. It became a gambling casino, a speculative hive, and nothing has been the same since that point. Countries no longer had sovereign control over their currencies. For example, before 71, you could not lend dollars to anybody unless it was done through an American bank. That went out the window with the euro dollar, the petrodollar crisis, and so forth. And then in 1979, Paul Volcker, who was then Federal Reserve Board chairman in the October Columbus Day weekend, stated that, quote, controlled disintegration is a legitimate objective of the 1980s. Now, this came from a Council of Foreign Relations study, which had about 23, 24 studies. And this was embodied in the monetary and economic study. And what's controlled disintegration? Well, you will control the collapse of an economy. You will bring it down purposely to deindustrialize, but you hope that you will control the process itself. So on Columbus Day weekend in October of 1979, Volcker took the interest rates in the US, which were already high, about 10.5% prime rate. And over the next several months took it up to 21.5%. This simply staggered the economy. And it made it even worse for the third world because the developing sector, if you compound 21.5% over 5 years, your debt doubles, even though you haven't incurred 1 cent of new debt. So they crumpled, the Western sector crumpled, and so forth. Next, please.
I just want to make a quick, I think it's as obvious to people who are listening on Twitter. We have a good number of people listening there, but I want to make it clear to people that the slides that Richard is referring to are featured at the top of the Twitter space. And so you can follow along. We're going to slide 3. Thank you. Richard, you can continue.
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, now this one, I'm going to explain it to you. There's a program called Excel with Microsoft. And it used to be you could put 3 axes on a graph very simply. But you have people there who want to assist you so much that you can put glitter on your graph, but you can no longer put 3 axes on the graph. Maybe that says something about Microsoft. So I'm going to reproduce for you with real numbers that same LaRouche triple curve. I'm going to leave out the middle curve for the purposes right now. The blue curve and the left hand axis, which says US Fin aggregates. That's the financial aggregates in the United States. And what that is I simply added up all the debt, household debt, mortgage debt, corporate debt, debt of financial institutions, and so forth, and added that to the valuation of stocks. And you will see that it does a spectacular rise. It was 5 trillion in 1979. So if you look at the very bottom of where the blue graph, blue line is, that's about 5 trillion. And it rises and rises until 2000, when it gets up to about 69 trillion. And then, 2010. And then in the last 12 years, it rises by a double. It goes from 69 to 134 trillion. Now, why do we call them financial aggregates? These are financial instruments, and some of them can be quite useful. But what has happened under the casinoized economy, which I mentioned earlier, is that many of these instruments have nothing to do with physical production, nothing to do with raising living standards. What they have to do is not only stock buybacks, real estate flipping, drug money that you're setting up operations for, an entire array of operations that have rising commercial properties, which get recorded under the real estate sector. And the stock market has almost no valuation that you would associate. It's right now $48 trillion. You may say, what is that? If you take the market value of each stock times the number of stocks for each of those stocks, and you multiply. So you'll have a stock that's $5, you have 100 shares of it, it's $500 market capitalization. Do it for every stock in the US economy. That is now $48 trillion. It's not the Dow Jones, it's actually more important than that. In stock valuations, which really, with a contracting physical base, which you will see, means that they're not worth that at all. In fact, the stock valuations right now are at least a factor of 20 greater than what they should be. But this thing rose since 2010, which obviously points to the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. You will then see in the grayish green curve the amount of steel we produced. And that was 125 million tons in 1979. And then if you look at the other end, I wrote it in very small, if you can see it, it's 89 million tons. So, okay, that's a fall of 29%. But then you look at the manufacturing workforce, and that is really critical. The manufacturing workforce went from 19.4 million, that's in 2000, and that's the red one. The red one, because of scale, doesn't look like it drops as much as it actually does. So we had 19.4 million manufacturing workers, people who actually produced. We're now in 2022, that digit's not shown on the chart, but it goes out to 2022. We're down to 12.6 million. That's a fall of 35%. We've lost more than 1/3 of the manufacturing workforce. So this is the triple curve. You can see it. And the aggregates are out of control. Now, I did not include, and I just want to mention to this, and we'll come to this at the end of the presentation, that I left out the value of derivatives. I will explain what derivatives are, but that is another 235 trillion. So if you add the 134 trillion that we see on the chart in blue, and you add 235, you get a total of 369 trillion dollars. That's trillion. This can't work. Now, to know why it can't work, it's not just that these things erupt and there's problems. And anytime someone in such a crisis starts to sell, other people start to sell, and valuations fall, and people are compelled to sell even more so they don't lose more, and that creates a self-feeding stampede. But it's actually physical. Think of an economy. This is the way LaRouche approaches a physical economy. You have three types of workers. You have those who alter nature, who physically alter nature, such as miners, construction, manufacturing, where you use a tool or a machine tool or another machine to alter something, like you take a piece of steel and turn it into a table. You take a piece of steel and you turn it into a machine that processes food. We also include in that transportation and utilities that produce power. That operation is essential. It's the backbone of an economy. It's what makes an economy productive. You have another part of the economy that's not productive, but you would call essential. For example, teachers, engineers, firemen, doctors, nurses, and so forth. So that's a second part of that economy that you have, not productive, but essential. And then you have a third part of the economy, which is neither productive nor essential. And in the United States, that's more than 72% of the entire economy. And that you can treat as overhead. But the wealth has to come out of the physical part of the economy and those who produce the physical part of the economy to support everything else. The problem is that each one of these financial aggregates that I showed you, take a bond has a yield. It could be 3%, it could be 4%, it's maybe 5 or 6%. A stock, it has what's called a dividend, 3, 4, 5%. Or a derivative, which has a certain type of rate of return. You cannot pay that out of paper. So ultimately, it comes out of the physical economy. Because if you simply keep paying paper out of paper, if I give you a yield with dollars that are worth nothing, it doesn't work. So the dollar has to be backed by something physical, which is the physical economy. And the more that these instruments rise in size, the greater the rate of return that they demand, the more that is taken out of the physical economy. That's why America is bankrupt. We're not yet illiquid, but that's the definition of bankruptcy. You cannot even service the debt except through artificial means. So this is the status that we have right now. Let us next look at the question of these. What happens when an economy reaches this stage? Well, there are three consequences of this triple curve process, triple curve collapse process. First, the attempt to hold up the fictitious value of the financial aggregates leads to an increase in the money supply. Now, we had an instance of that. It was in 1923, Weimar, Germany. In Weimar, Germany, between March and November of 1923, the money supply increased 100 billion times. Okay, that's the span of 8 months. And you've probably seen the pictures of people with wheelbarrows going to the store to buy a loaf of bread. But the fundamental feature is that is what we're on the cusp of having. And we're seeing that. If energy prices go up 12 times in Europe, that's just the beginning of such a process. That will wipe out all people's savings and so forth. The second is that this will fail. And when it fails, it will wipe out several hundreds of trillions of dollars, which will vaporize the economy. It will shut it down. The interbank market will freeze up. Hundreds of thousands of companies will go under. If people have questions about that, we can go through it, but that's what's going to happen. And third, and this is already happening, and we discussed it partly, to hold up the values, the City of London Wall Street banks suck wealth out of the labor force. And they're applying ferocious austerity. Living standards, if this thing goes into the collapse that we're now talking about, living standards will be cut as much as 20 to 50%. And the financier oligarchy will result to fascism. People will be pushed below the level of subsistence that they need for existence. And worldwide, tens to hundreds of millions of people will die. And that's not an exaggeration to frighten you. That is true. Now, to be able to transform the economy out of a situation like this, in order to build a new Bretton Woods, we should have an introduction to and know what economics really is. And at the heart of this is Lyndon LaRouche's economic method, is the difference between starkly different views. On the one side, what's called entropy and barbarism, and on the other side, anti-entropy and creativity. So in 1851, a German physicist named Rudolf Clausius, in a paper entitled On the Moving Force of Heat, stated in a technical way, which I'll just give you the meaning of. He talks about the fact that there's an irreversible process of going from hotter to cooler temperatures as a part of a heat transfer. But what he then said, and this is the critical point, is he said that this translates, and we can go into what the technical features are, but really they're not as important. What he then said is that this means simply that in a heat engine, the total entropy never decreases, but it will increase, and except in a couple of special cases. Or more simply put, entropy always increases. Now, this, it's known that entropy does exist. I'm going to say what it is in a second. In the case of heat-powered machines, that was known by Sadi Carnot in 1825. His papers in 1851. Sadi Carnot did not, however, endorse Clausius' view. So it's true for systems in the small, but it's not true for the universe as a whole. And if you can understand that, you can start to understand real economics. Now, what Clausius did is to assert that entropy is a universal law, therefore it applies in the whole. And he associated entropy with increasing disorder and randomness, an irreversible transformation of the world into greater disorganization and lower forms of effectiveness and power. In my words, what I would just say, and this has been said by others, what Clausius is stating is that the universe is irreversibly decomposing. Now, that's a complete lie. But in 1952, MIT professor Norbert Wiener, who's one of the founders of artificial intelligence, in a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, stated the following. And if you can put this up, Daniel, please. Sooner or later, we shall die. And it is highly probable that the whole universe around us will die the heat death from entropy. That's what he was talking about. In which the world would be reduced to one vast temperature equilibrium in which nothing really new ever happens. There will be nothing left but a drab uniformity, out of which we can expect only minor and insignificant local fluctuations. So the universe is going to die from entropy. This idea of an irreversible process in a single direction toward disorder and death, that's what it is. This is science and technology can do nothing to undo this. Give up all hope. This is taught in 90%, 8% of all universities worldwide. This is the underpinning, along with Malthusianism, of the Club of Rome's 1972 genocidal book, Limits to Growth. Now, from late 1948 onward, Lyndon LaRouche made one of the greatest contributions to true science. He showed that rather than entropy, the actual principle of the universe is what he termed anti-entropy. He introduced this term. Instead of destruction and lower forms of existence, the universe's characteristic is rising from lower to higher forms of existence, from disorder to more beautiful organization. Next, please. Okay. This is from LaRouche with a discussion with some of his associates in 2002. What you're dealing with is the fact that the human mind introduces a factor of anti-entropy, which does not exist otherwise. And the animal species don't have it. Only the human mind has that particular kind of anti-entropic potentiality. Human creativity, that is anti-entropy, the rejection of entropy, the rejection of all this kind of crap we're getting now, is the essential precondition for the existence of the human species. The environmentalist of today is an enemy of the human species. There is a universal process. It's not a microcosm process. It's not an interaction process of microcosms. It's an overall process, which is a self-developing, true anti-entropic process. And you look at the total energy flux density represented by the whole system from our record of the system, you find that anti-entropy is the dominant characteristic of the entire system. And the fact that you aren't able to maintain the rate of anti-entropy means that your species is out of business. Now, to locate this, let's look at what this means. The anti-entropic process applies to your human mind. What does that mean? Each time the mind discovers a new physical principle or a new principle in music or art, the mind moves to a higher level. The mind creates an ordered sequence of new discoveries of physical principle or art or so forth, or rediscovers old ones by, for example, looking at how Kepler figured out the ordering of the universe. This is anti-entropic creativity. The mind keeps adding on the new dimensionalities of power, new abilities to master the universe. No one individual makes just these discoveries, but hundreds of millions of individuals in the entire human species. And then they bring them into society, where society as a living body creates new generation of people, young boys, young girls, whose power it is to be even more creative than the previous generation. And that's a self-subsisting power. So what would that mean? How does that work in the economy? And this is critical because there's a complete difference from Marx, it's a complete difference from Adam Smith and nutcases like Milton Friedman. These discoveries that man makes are transmitted to the physical economy to generate scientific advance and produce higher productivity. That's what it does. So let's look at this table, the next one, please, of energy density. Okay, so let's look at the combustion of wood. You'll see it up there. And that just means how many joules are produced per gram of wood. Gram is not a lot. So you have 1.8 times 10 to the fourth. Okay, so that's 18,000. What happens is, that's the energy density of wood. But if you have a society based on wood, probably its mode of transportation is walking. And his method of agriculture may be hunting and picking berries. Let's move to another level. A society through human discovery, discovered how to burn coal in a heat-powered machine. Coal's energy density, as you will see up there, is 2.7 times 10 to the fourth joules per gram of input of fuel supply. But this economy already has a mode of transportation which may be a steamship or railroad, no longer walking. Its method of agriculture may be organized farming and raising livestock. Now, our economy is on the cusp, if we apply ourselves, to be powered by fusion. Fusion's energy density, you can locate it there on the chart if you look at it, is 8.2 times 10 to the 10th, or if you use tritium, deuterium reactions, 3.2 times 10 to the 11th. Now, what does that mean? Well, compare it to coal. It's, instead of 10 to the fourth, it's 10 to the 7th. That's 7 orders of magnitude. That means it is 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 7 times greater than the previous one. All right. That's 7 million times more energy dense. And energy density gives you a greater power over nature, and it gives you a greater power to whatever tool you're operating, the machine tool or so forth. What you want is increasing energy density. That's what the Green New Deal is meant to shut down. That's what Norbert Wiener is meant to shut down. That's what the stupid policy coming from the Biden administration and some of the Republicans, almost no difference. Well, now we're talking real power. And under such a system, what are you going to have? Well, your mode of transportation will not be walking. It'll probably be high-speed rail or magnetic levitation trains, or moving through the solar system through nuclear-powered rockets. Agriculture will consist of every agriculture you know, but it'll also be hydroponics, major irrigation processes, and so forth. Now conceptualize the process. Mankind is anti-entropic, moving from one manifold of development, which is what the first one was based on wood, to a higher manifold of development, to a still higher manifold of development of greater power and efficiency, of greater living standards. This unbroken process of progress never ends. This is real economics. This is the economics that we are looking at. It's completely not running down, it's completely running up because of the quality of the human mind. And that's where you have to start. Forget materialism, it's wrong. It just misses the point. And the stuff that comes out of Adam Smith is, Adam Smith has a whole section of his Wealth of Nations on opium trade, in which the British imposed upon China using opium grown in Bengal, which the Indians didn't want either. And when the Chinese tried to fight twice, the British sent 1841 and 1861, the British sent in more advanced ships at the time, and just blew up entire ports of China and took over 91 ports throughout the whole of China. China calls this the period of degradation, the century of degradation, and they have not forgotten. So this is what mankind is. This is real economics. What I'm going to show you now, and let me just say one thing. The power of the human mind is to celebrate this. What's art? What's poetry? Well, it can be very beautiful. Beethoven Late Quartet's quite beautiful. But it's a celebration of the power of man to be creative. And you make, as a thought object, this very creative process. And you try to build a youth that reflects it, which must have a certain living standard and a cultural standard, so that they can assimilate that. And when you wipe out entire countries like Afghanistan or Yemen through a genocidal policy, the US and Britain were in Afghanistan for 20 years, and it went worse. And that was deliberate. That wasn't accidental. When you do that to Africa, that's what we have to put an end to. So we're going to do it through a Bretton Woods. So I want to just give you what the old Bretton Woods was of Roosevelt and what the new Bretton Woods is and can become. So from July 1st through July 24th in 1944, let me just show you. This is just the same thing, but it's presented from the weight. So if you get the same amount of power from, now this is nuclear fission, which we also need to develop, for 75 milligrams of uranium, or if you want to put it in American terms, 0.00017 pounds. From 0.00017 pounds, 17 10,000ths, you get this an energy equivalent to 1 ton of wood or 500 pounds of coal. I am not saying we shouldn't use coal and oil. We should. And we actually can produce a lot of clean coal, which you're not told about. But we can move to a higher energy flux density. Okay, next one, please. So from July 1st through July 24th at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, President Franklin Roosevelt, represented by leading members of his cabinet and team, and representatives from 43 other countries, debated and approved a treaty agreement for a new world credit system and monetary system. And this, from Roosevelt's point of view, this would produce self-feeding anti-entropic growth, of the anti-entropy I just said. I don't think Roosevelt was conscious of the term anti-entropy, but his thinking reflected that. And he also talked about the need to wipe out British, Dutch, and French colonialism from the face of the earth. So Roosevelt's policy originated as good neighbor policy, which he announced March 4th, 1933, when he was inaugurated. He based his ideas on Alexander Hamilton. He wrote an essay on Hamilton's policy, how it helped create the U.S. and Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. His great-great-grandfather, who's named Isaac Roosevelt, who was known as Isaac the Patriot in the family, was a collaborator of Hamilton. He literally helped pass the U.S. Constitution in the Constitutional Convention in 1777 in Poughkeepsie, New York. And he also helped finance the American Revolution. And if you go to Hyde Park, which I would urge all of you to do for enjoyment, you'll see when you go into the dining room area, where it always was, is a huge portrait of Isaac Roosevelt. This is what greeted Franklin every morning. And he wrote about his great-great-grandfather. In 1928, Roosevelt wrote a piece in the July issue of Foreign Affairs entitled Our Foreign Policy, A Democratic View. And what he did is he actually threw down the gauntlet, and he denounced dollar diplomacy, in which countries in Ibero-America, or what some people call Latin America, were looted, and U.S. Marines were sent in to collect the debt for largely European countries. And what he did is he sought, in effect, to bring people to John Quincy Adams' Monroe Doctrine, which was based on, if you read it, setting up between the United States and Ibero-America, quote, a community of perfectly sovereign nation states. So to develop all of Ibero-America, Roosevelt focuses ideas on Brazil. Now, Brazil has 44% of the landmass of Ibero-America, and even then was one of the 10 most populous countries there. This is Roosevelt visiting Ibero-America, Brazil in 1936, and he's meeting with Getulio Vargas, who's also seated, who was the president. In 1939, of Brazil, Henry Dexter White, or Harry Dexter White, whichever you want to choose, who was the director of monetary affairs in the U.S. Treasury Department, wrote an internal memo entitled, quote, specific proposals for immediate United States-Brazil cooperation. And in this memo, if we can have the next one, please. Okay, this is what he calls for. I'm not going to go through it in depth, but this is a 1939 internal memo. The United States will finance Brazil's purchase of machinery, materials, and technical skills. He says later on that these will all remain in Brazilian hands, though, once they're purchased. He built a 1,500-mile long railroad north and south through the interior of Brazil, build a merchant marine, utilize Brazil's water power resources, build an iron and steel industry in Brazil, develop complementary agricultural production. The idea was develop. Forget the past relations. Those are over. This is what the United States is committed to. Now, in the fall of 1942, Roosevelt set up a U.S. mission to Brazil, which was headed by his collaborator, Morris Llewellyn Cook. Next one, please. Cook may not be familiar to you at all. Because when you read history, they put out certain stars, the heroes. And the people who actually sometimes do something and who are quite creative just don't make it into the history books. He administered the Rural Electrification Administration, which strung up electricity lines, people may know, to the rural community of the United States and to all the farms, and electrified the farms in 1930 and 1940s and transformed the way that they operated. So Cook is sent by Roosevelt with 12 other American engineers in the fall of 1942, and they're dispatched to Brazil, where they work with three great patriots of Brazil. Next, please. Getulio Vargas, who we've already met, president of Brazil, Oswaldo Aranha, who's a Brazilian foreign minister, and Juan, that's the way you say those names, Alberto Lins de Barros, who was the coordinator of the economic mobilization of Brazil, and who was the co-coordinator along with Cook of this special mission. And he was greeted by 100 engineers from Brazil. So 12 American engineers, 100 Brazilian engineers, and so forth. And together they wrote a 200-page book evaluating every aspect of the Brazilian economy and the steps to industrialize and modernize Brazil from top to bottom. This was a pivotal example of an industrialized nation and a developing sector nation, the US and Brazil, collaborating for Brazil's development. This is a paradigm. If it could be done here, it could be done anywhere. I just want to give you three brief examples of what they did. Next, please. Now, this is Brazil. You can see Colombia and Venezuela and Bolivia and so forth. What they wanted to do was, and they work on, was to integrate the Orinoco and the Negro rivers, dredge them, make them navigable, connect them so that one could have boat traffic. And then they would connect the two rivers to the Amazon, which is the mightiest river in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the three leaders I showed you, this was their dream for decades, and for many Brazilians, if you read the literature. But they could never get a situation in which this could happen because they were diluted by debt. Now, the United States was saying, we will work with you on this project. Second project, and this is just a representation of 12 different projects. The San Francisco Valley, which is in the northeast of Brazil. It's in the north, Pernambuco and Bahia. They wanted to turn this, and did, into a Tennessee Valley Authority, which means you tame the rivers, use the waters for agriculture, and unleash tremendous hydroelectric, this is electric power, electricity. So what you see here is a picture of the Paulo Alfonso hydroelectric complex in Bahia State, Brazil. When it became fully operational in 1955, and it was built during the 1940s, it had 23 operational units with 4.2 megawatts of electricity generating capacity. Today, this was extended throughout Brazil. Brazil gets 83% of all its electricity from hydropower. It's the highest of any country in the world. And the third and the crown jewel was the building of a steel plant. Next, please. This is the translation of the Brazilian, just means the National Steel Company of Brazil. Today, it's the second largest. It's located at Volta Redonda, which is about 90 miles away from Rio de Janeiro. And what this did, this is an absolutely remarkable example of what Roosevelt really thought. They built coke ovens, blast furnaces, an open hearth, a looming mill, a rail and structural steel mill, so forth and so on. By the time it was completed in the 1950s, it would have a 1 million tons of steel production capacity. That was the largest steel mill in Ibero-America. It was one of the largest in the world, except for a couple places like Gary, Indiana, and in Chicago. It was larger than almost all steel mills in Europe. But to build it, the Brazilians ran into trouble. They didn't have money. So what the United States did, it used the Export-Import Bank, which was part of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And we can talk about that during the question period. But Roosevelt used that like a Hamiltonian National Bank. He would have never gotten a Hamiltonian National Bank to the Congress, or so he thought. So he used something that had been used to bail out the railroads under Hoover, turned it around, and it financed the greatest amount of financing, including a good part of the New Deal. Anyway, this Export-Import Bank, which was at that time a division of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, lent Brazil $45 million of the plant's total construction cost of $65 million, which meant it lent it 2/3 of all the money. So this is an example of Hamiltonian directed credit, which will serve us well. In toto, the US was transmitting scientific technological packages and infusing them directly into the Brazilian economy. This is the cornerstone of the Bretton Woods system. The US also developed other countries. I won't go into it in depth, but they formed what they call fomentos, which were development corporations in Chile, Haiti, Cuba, Peru. The fomento in Colombia built a tannin plant, a plant for milk pasteurization, sulfuric acid plant, all with money from the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Then in 1944, to go back to where we started, at the Bretton Woods Conference, of the 44 delegates at the conference, 19 of them were for Ibero-America. And this is 43% of all the delegates. The British went nuts. John Maynard Keynes, who led the British delegation, who was a genuine fascist and a member of the Eugenics Society, what he wrote is, if we can go to the next one, Daniel, it's the one after this. You brought up one. And next one, and then the next one. Okay, so this is Keynes. And this is what he writes about these countries in Ibero-America. 21 countries have been invited to Bretton Woods, which clearly have nothing to contribute and will merely encumber the ground, namely Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Liberia, Nicaragua, Panama, Philippines, Venezuela, Peru, Uruguay, Ethiopia, Iceland, Iran, Iraq. The most monstrous monkey house assembled for years. That was Keynes's view of these people. Now, this was not an accident. They were there because they were all committed to development. And in this situation, the United States, not Keynes, prevailed. You read in the books, Keynes founded Bretton Woods, just simply didn't happen. Last thing from this then, please. Go back to the early one. So I just want to put to you, this is from the Articles Agreement for what you call the World Bank, and it's officially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. These are the founding Articles of Agreement. And I just want to give you part of Article 1. The purpose of the bank are, quote, Section 1, to assist in the reconstruction and development of territories of members by facilitating the investment of capital for productive purposes, including the restoration of economies destroyed or disrupted by war, that's Europe, the reconversion of productive facilities to peacetime needs, that's the US, and the encouragement of the development of productive facilities in resources in less developed countries. Now, reflecting the outlook of the United States, Section 3 is quite interesting. It calls for taking actions, particularly in less developed countries, quote, by encouraging international investment of the productive resources of members, thereby assisting in raising their productivity, the standard of living, and the conditions of labor. Now, the IMF, after Roosevelt died, becomes quite different. It becomes an enforcer of a banker's collection. The other thing that they did at this conference is they set up a fixed exchange rate system. We can discuss that more in the question period, but it means that you take currencies and you set a parity between whatever it is, 3 German Deutschmarks to 2 US dollars. There's a way of determining that, but you want fixed exchange rates for 2 reasons. Number one, you want to be able, if you're buying a good from Germany, not to have the rate change in the middle of the week and suddenly you're paying 23% more, or Germany buying from the United States. 2, you stop the depreciation of your currency, because speculators can destroy your currency, like happened in 1997 when George Soros destroyed the Thai baht, the Malaysian ringgit, the Philippines peso. And the third thing, it was linked to gold. We can discuss that, but the dollar was pegged to $35 per ounce of gold, and then all the rest of the world was pegged to the US dollar. This was directed credit all over the world. Now, Roosevelt died April 12, 1945. The stunning scope of the Bretton Woods system was not realized. It did produce noticeable margins of growth in the West until a weak President Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve system and they went to the floating rate system in the gambling casinos, which we've discussed. Today, for the reasons I've mentioned to you, we need even more forcefully a new Bretton Woods system based on the premises and principles of Bretton Woods of 1944, but going beyond that. I'm going to just mention a couple of points of this, because what I want to show you, and some of you I know have read our Lambridge reports or looked at them, but that's what's critical here. Because when you're talking about a credit system, it's important to know how you get the credit. But it's very important that you have a mission for the credit. It's not just a matter of talking about credit. You have to have a purpose and a directionality. What we need to do now is we need to put the world through bankruptcy reorganization, especially the banks. And we're going to use the Glass-Steagall Law of 1933. It's going to have two simultaneous steps. First, we're going to take the banks like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and we're going to split them into a commercial bank and an investment bank. The investment bank is the bank that's been speculating in derivatives, that's been trying to arbitrage currencies and so forth like that. That bank is going to have those instruments. If they fail, which they will, those banks will go under. We will not put a penny into trying to bail them out, not a single cent. In 2007, 2008, $19.4 trillion worth of credit lines were extended to the banks in the United States and around the world through the Federal Reserve. Then the second part is we'll have commercial banks. And we will make sure that they will be able to lend for industry, agriculture, home purchases, permit companies to write payroll, finance hard commodity trade, and so forth. The other process will be for the Treasury or some other agency to write down the financial instruments. So if we can have the next one, please. And this is the last section, just for people. We'll skip this for a second. We'll skip the next one for a second. Go to the one after that, please. Next, okay. Let's just go back one time. In this 1975 piece that LaRouche wrote for an international development bank, one of the first things he says, wiping out fictitious capital. And fictitious capital means it has no productive features behind it. It's just paper. Is a prelude to recovery. So we're going to do that. Let's look at the next one, please. We're now going to look at the financial instruments for the world. Earlier, I showed you what debt was in the United States. Worldwide, it's $296 trillion. Capitalization, of world stock market is 104 trillion. And the world derivatives market is 900 trillion. That comes to speculative paper, or not all of it, but financial paper of 1,300 trillion or 1.3 quadrillion dollars. We could never support that or pay that off, even if we sold everything in the United States, including all your children, which we would not do. You couldn't even meet a tenth of that. It's unpayable. It can never be paid. So we're going to write it down. For the derivatives, and I will just say what a derivative is very briefly. We can just put there because they're very powerful. And that's what was failing and caused the British crisis the other day that we talked about earlier. A derivative is a side bet. Think of two guys gambling, shooting dice in an alley, Johnny and Bill. And then someone who's standing behind them, watching this, observing this, named Frank, turns to the person next to him and says, I bet you that Johnny's going to win. So they're not doing the primary betting. He's making a bet upon a bet, a second bet. That's what derivatives are. They're interest rate futures, they're commodity futures and options, they're credit default swaps. We can discuss them. They're discussable. This comes to $1.3 quadrillion. My colleague, Paul Gallagher, has a slightly lower figure. My other colleague, Dennis Small, has a slightly higher figure. But most banks are counterparties to these derivatives. That means they're on one side of the bet. If 50 trillion of these derivatives or 25 trillion go bad, the whole financial system goes. That will wipe out the books. So the first step is Glass-Steagall writing down this, how much we'll write off. Some of the other debt, like some of the debt that was the household debt, the business debt, some of them may be legitimate. We'll keep that on the books. The banks will be much slimmer. Instead of JP Morgan Chase having 3.9 trillion in assets, they may only sport something like 500 billion in assets, but there'll be real assets. There'll be assets to industry. There'll be assets to agriculture. There'll be assets to machine tool plants, to nuclear power plants. There'll be real assets rather than fictitious assets. The next part is that we're going to create a national bank. So that's step 2. Nationalize the Fed or abolish the Fed. Set up a bank. What does a national bank do? It's sovereign. On the board of a national bank, instead of the normal group of people that you would expect, you're going to put some engineers, some farmers, some machine tool people, people who own companies, people who are competent, people who can think about what an economy is. And you will lend. And we can put the National Bank of the United States, a third national bank, because we've had 2 before. The first was under Hamilton, second under Monroe. We can create $1 trillion worth of credit and put it into projects in the United States. For example, Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, you may have seen about a month and a half ago, their water system went because they were not, they had very ancient purification processes. I did some calculations. They would need probably $500 million to put in the most advanced purification processes with ultraviolet light, doing various cleansing operations and either, reverse osmosis and so forth. We can't spend that. No, we can't spend that. But we could spend $19.4 trillion to bail out the banks in 2007, 2008, or pump $69 billion in counting into a genocidal war in Ukraine, which doesn't benefit Ukrainians, where Ukrainians are just proxies. So we're going to create a national bank, which has the lending authority, but with one proviso. It has to be for productive purposes. Agriculture, manufacturing, utilities, transportation, those which alter nature, or for education facilities and things like that. But if it's not, National Bank doesn't lend. You want to go out and get it from somewhere else, fine. But the National Bank will lend at 1 to 2%. Third, we're going to set up an international bank. Replace the IMF. Don't try and reform it. It's just not reformable. Don't try and go back into it and fix a little part. We have to change the whole thing from the top. So if I can have the previous slide, and then I'll just show you the last things. Going backwards now. Then we had, one before that. So in 1975, LaRouche just had returned from Iraq, and he put together how the International Development Bank will work. Next, please. And I put down at the bottom, I just showed you 1975. I wrote 1995, but anyway. So we wipe out the fictitious capital. What the Third World requires, this is what he wrote in this pamphlet, is the ability, what the Third World requires is the ability to create wealth through massive infusions of advancing technology. And then he writes, if you look at this next paragraph with it in the middle of it, the expanded output and intermediate and long-term credits and grants arrangements for its third world consumption must be the kernel of an intersectorial treaty agreement. And Bretton Woods was a treaty agreement. We would have another treaty agreement among nations related to the International Development Bank operations. We would bring in India, China, Russia, Pakistan, all of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, and the United States. You may say, well, how are you going to bring the United States in? That's a very interesting question, but we can do it. So let us now look at what we're going to put this money towards, because it's not the, it's the what you're going to do. So if we can just have this, it's just a few of the projects. Next one, please. Okay, we're going to build a world land bridge, where you build transportation corridors, but they're not just rail systems. And they should be high speed or maglev, including carrying freight. What they're doing is you build 100 miles on either side of the rail system, a spine. That rail system is your spine. Cities, water systems, power systems, That's what the Transcontinental Railroad did to the United States in the 1870s, 1860s, and actually 1870s and beyond. And we had 4 transcontinental railroads. It built entire cities like Omaha and so forth, which sprung out of this. I just want to show you the numbers there. You can look at this on another occasion. Number 1 is the Bering Strait. Now that separates through the Diomedes, large and small Diomedes islands up there, Russia from the United States. We would take goods from Tierra del Fuego, which is in the very south of Iberoamerica, go all the way up through Iberoamerica, through number 2, the Darien Gap, which passes through Panama, all the way through the United States, across Canada, across Alaska, into Russia. And then that would then connect to the Trans-Siberian rail line and then go all the way to Rotterdam or Amsterdam. We would then take this line entirely down to Africa. And these would be connecting lines. Some exist, and those are the green. Some don't exist. Those are the red. And we're going to build them. Because if you build what the Chinese call connectivity, if you build this, you then raise the productivity. Again, think of the earlier manifolds. How fast and how much can you do if you're having horses or human walking, even horses pulling wagons, versus what you can do if you have trains and steamships, versus what you can do if you have high-speed magnetic levitated trains, which can travel at speeds of 300 to 400 miles per hour. Next, please. Now, this is Africa. We're going to build rail lines in Africa. Most of the rail lines that have existed in Africa were only to get raw materials out to the ports. So this shows you a central rail corridor from Dar es Salaam over to Kigali. It shows you another one from Mombasa to Kisangani. And we're going to build these rail lines all the way up. One's already existing up to Djibouti, which is where the star is up in north, through Addis Ababa, and so on. But we're going to build them across the entire continent. That takes money. And it's going to have an international development bank. Next, please. This shows that we're going to connect the Zambezi River, Lake Malawi, and other lakes as one navigable system, but also for water diversion. If you look up there and if you can see Lake Chad, which is sort of to the left of center, and it's below the Mediterranean Sea down, we're going to fill up the Lake Chad, which has been depleted water. Now, how do you do this? Well, each country is going to have a national bank, which will advance certain credit. But credit can't be created like that. Yes, it can be. Credit comes from the word credo, to believe. And the idea is you create credit based on your plans for the future to enrich the present. And it will more than pay for itself by the increased level of economic activity and the revenues it generates, even if you never collect a dime from the building of the projects themselves. That's the way Hamilton thought. That's the way LaRouche thinks. And so we will build those with some startup money from the National Bank. The International Development Bank, or whatever you want to call it, World Bank for Development and Reconstruction, will kick in more. We could capitalize the the banks of different countries by a few $100 billion. If we build a third national bank in the United States, we should capitalize it at approximately $1 trillion with the capability of lending up to $10 trillion. If we have an international development bank, we could capitalize that at $10 trillion with the capability of lending to $50 trillion. That provides the credit, but for these missions. Last one, please, or last set of this point. Now, this is Haiti. Haiti is within 200 miles of the United States. We have let it rot because it's black. Even though the Constitution of Haiti, under Toussaint Louverture, was written by certain persons whose name you may be familiar with, Alexander Hamilton, who was very much against slavery. Haiti needs everything. Haiti is living on charcoal. They don't have electricity for most of the part. They live on literally charcoal, which means they're burning down trees and burning down part of the island because they've been left in such a backward condition. So one of the things we did is we developed a whole development program for Haiti. And we found some plans that the Chinese had already done. They don't have a single sewage treatment plant for the entire island of 11 million people. Chinese worked out a 180,000 cubic meters per day plant. And you can see the map of that. We included this in our development plan. Next, please. They need a water purification plant. And this would be 225 cubic meters per day. And the Chinese actually worked out how they would build it. They've built this in other countries through the Belt and Road. Next, please. Now, this is our own drawing. And it puts where the power plants would be. They're little simple water treatment plants. And going across the island from Fort Liberté through up through the north, all the way across the coast, down to Carrefour, and then Jérémie, and so forth, all the way down to Jacmel, we would build a high-speed rail. And there were people who told me from Haiti, we talked to engineers and various people on Haiti to put this program together, who told me that there were plans for such railroads. They were not built. We would also build, if you see the hatch marks, up to Fort Liberté and down to Jacmel, a high-speed rail system. We would build a cement plant, because if you're going to develop a country, you need to start that way. Now, last concept. How do you go about developing these countries? Well, Helga LaRouche, who's the head of the Schiller Institute, has proposed this. You start by building hospitals. If we were to build enough hospitals in the world with about the concept that we have in the United States of 4.5 beds per 1,000 people, we would need to build 32,000 new hospitals. Most of them would be in the developing sector. But a hospital needs electricity. I mean, think of it. How are you going to have an operating room with candles? Some countries do. How are you going to store serum unless you have refrigeration? So you would need massive electricity. You would also need water. A hospital needs a tremendous amount of water for purification and all sorts of other processes. That means that you're calling coal into existence, not just the hospitals, to raise the health level of the country. And we also have to have purification plants for clear water. But you're going to have to build water systems, irrigation systems, and put in electricity, which means we're going to put in nuclear power plants and clean coal plants. Now, what does this do? Where are the orders from these going to come from? Well, Haiti doesn't have the capability of almost any of those things. And they don't even have a single cement plant. There was a big plan for it. We put it into our program to revive that cement plant, which was proposed by the French ambassador to Haiti about 10 years ago. We dug up the plan. But what it's going to do is it's going to come from the advanced sector. So the advanced sector is going to send machine tools, power plants, the technology, the various, some of the immediate beds and the various systems that go over beds to telemetrics to monitor. Haiti's going to build cement. It's going to build roads. We're going to put an intensive education process in to Haiti to build 4 to 5 new engineering schools and to have a civilian conservation corps type of approach for the youth who are unemployed. I mean, they have over a 50% youth unemployment rate. And many of them join gangs, as you probably have read about. And we're going to put them to camps where they will get education in the evening, and they will work to develop and work on building hospitals, as well as serving to lower level operations, jobs in hospitals, to send them to schools, massive work on educational systems. Now that feeds orders from the West. Let me give you one last example of how this works. So let's say the United States contacts Westinghouse and says, we want you to build a nuclear power plant. So Westinghouse will go to its national bank and get a certain amount of credit. The commercial bank, more likely than not, will get some credit from the national bank and then finance some of it from a regular bank. So it'll be blended credit. It'll get 1 to 2% from the government and whatever the commercial bank charges, which may be 3 to 4%. And money will be put in by an international development bank. So you have all 3 levels operating. This will open up American factories. We have had 32,000 American factories closed since 1998. Some of them are too old, but some of them have machine tools. You rip out the old machine tools, you put in new machine tools. People know how to do it. The auto industry knows how to do it. They retool every single year for a new model year, which is generally just a new design of the outward. You could retool them to produce almost anything. We did that during World War II. Therefore, you have orders being generated in the West, in the United States, for tens of billions of dollars, which reopens factories, which puts people back to work, which starts to give a future to Americans, and becomes a self-reciprocating. The more we develop the developing sector, the more the developed sector, like Europe, Japan, Russia, well, they're not as developed, but they still have a certain capabilities, develop. It's a self-feeding process which keeps growing in the the anti-entropic way that I showed you before when we discussed anti-entropy. This is how it's going to work. Now, the last thing I just want to say is this. If we have the possibility of taking this initiative, and I call on all of you who are on this phone call to join us, and to join us next on October 15th of a bigger youth conference we're going to have. But the purpose is not to just gather knowledge, it's to organize. It's to put this knowledge into place so that it's potent and makes a difference. That every single human being can make a difference. If we don't succeed, what will happen? Well, I mentioned that there'll be fascist austerity. Now, people hear the word fascist and they just think someone I don't like, or someone who killed Jews, which they did, and gypsies. And by the way, they killed a lot of Slavs, a lot of Russians, a lot of Poles. But you can see fascism if you look at what really happened in Auschwitz. What was Auschwitz? It was a work camp. They put people to work. They worked them at a level that required 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. They fed them less than 800 calories a day. People consumed themselves. And when they could no longer stand on the work lines, they were killed. And originally they killed them with bullets, but they found that too expensive. And so they had some accountants who said, we can use Zyklon B gas. And then they took the teeth and they took the skin for lampshades. That's fascism. And I'm not saying it doesn't have other elements, but this was an economic policy put in by Hajjamar Schacht, and who was the head of the Reichsbank who put Hitler into power, and by Montague Norman, who was the head of the Bank of England. That's the consequences we will face. And it's already going on in the third world. Just look at Yemen, just look at Syria, just look at what's going on right now in Afghanistan. And that's why we have to act.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to do a little bit of a technical check. Seems like we're okay. We've had a strong audience of about maybe 60 people watching you the whole time through, participating in this. And I invite people who would like to raise questions to do so. Frank, if you're on and you'd like to speak up, then please go ahead. And if not, or if people need a little bit of time to gather their thoughts, I have at least 2 questions that came in by text.
Hello, Richard. I really enjoyed your presentation. So I also gave a presentation on this during the World Land Bridge show, and I was able to learn a lot about LaRouche's his proposals for how to solve the current crisis that we're facing. But I had encountered many questions from people, some of which I felt I didn't have satisfactory answers for. So I wanted to bring some of these questions to you, and perhaps you would be able to give me an explanation for some of these questions. And there a lot of these are like sort of on the economic. For example, one of the questions I got was why build rail into like the middle of nowhere, right? What happens if you just build, for example, you have the World Land Bridge and you have these huge sections across Siberia, across northern Canada. What happens if just you build the trains and nobody ends up using them, and then you have all these billions of dollars which then you cannot pay off with the revenue from the trains, or from tax dollars of people actually developing the land around them. I live in Canada here, and we have a vast country that's underdeveloped, but at the same time, the cities are becoming more and more crowded, and then ironically, all these sort of smaller towns and counties are actually kind of depopulated. So we're seeing this phenomenon of, in Canada, one of the lowest population density countries in the world, where the cities are very crowded and there's very little activity going on in the countryside. So how would you answer this question?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And what I'd say, Frank, is, if I can call you that, look, there's a few things at play here, but it's the other way around, in the sense most people think of it as, well, if you can't get people there, or there's no people there now, why build in that area? It's you're just running across open land. I would say three things. Number one, China has built a land bridge to Duisburg in Germany, which is it's not a port; they call it a land port, and they've built a rail system, and it is very slowly. The first few years, the cargo levels were very small, but they knew it would grow. And now they're actually able to ship a certain level, except it got disrupted because some of it went through Russia's rail system. And since the sanctions, it's been slowed down or stopped. But they were demonstrating a principle, which is that when you go through land, you can develop those corridors. The difficulty in Canada and United States, well, let me say Canada, because part of it is, if we develop through rail systems from Canada, for example, because you have to go up through Alberta and elsewhere, up to go to connected to Russia, through Alaska and then into Russia. Alaska is very underpopulated, much more so, although there are sections of Canada that are underpopulated. So you want to start to open up those potentials. There are raw materials, there are factories that can be built, and you want to start to bring them in, and you would want to start to bring them into Canada as well. The cold plays a role, and what's called permafrost plays a role. And I was looking at this because Russia's been trying to develop its Far East and also Siberia. Far East is, to the furthest part, Yakutia and so forth like that, and Krasnoyarsk and so forth. Permafrost is very difficult to deal with, and it's going to take like a terraforming approach, like we're going to take to develop Mars, because it can be cold like a tundra, but sometimes it melts. You may know this better than I do, Frank. It just turns into mud. So you have a problem that you can't sometimes build structures. You have to figure out how to do spot welding and all sorts of things, build things off the ground. Plus, sometimes it's just so cold that people don't necessarily want to live there. However, and I don't know what's going on in Canada, so you probably know it better than I do. I do know what the Russians are doing, because they've been holding every year a Far Eastern Economic Forum. They have interested the Chinese to invest in soy and other production in the Far East. The Far East is 40% of the land area of Russia. It's 2/3 the land area of China. It's very big, very underpopulated. So what you're going to do is, they have been working with them to develop soybeans and other projects that would be then shipped south, which means some of the Chinese population is moving in there, and some of them have experience with living in very cold climates. The Indians are working on projects up there too. They're building infrastructure. The problem, and the Russians they are allocating the highest level of infrastructure that they can to that area. The highest level of industrial development, Putin said this about 4 months ago. Most people don't pay any attention to any of this stuff. They're only interested that Putin's the villain of everything. Oh, my plant is not growing. Must have been Vladimir Putin. But the thing is, Putin pointed out that the highest rate of industrial development that's going on in the entire country is in the Russian Far East. The problem is that it's so big that you don't notice it immediately, and it consumes a lot of infrastructure. So my answer to you would be, as we develop these, as we figure out terraforming, how to form areas, how to do different agricultural processes, which can be used. And they're giving all sorts of incentives. The Russians are, they're building up the universities. If you come to live there, they're giving workers about a 30% higher income, and they're subsidizing the industries. It happens. So I can't tell you what's going on in the area of Canada, but I can tell you that these development corridors have proven in other parts of Russia, in parts of the United States, like up in Minnesota, which is not the most inviting area, but we built one of the 5 transcontinental railroads. Everyone thinks it's the one that went through Utah is the only one. And people did live there. So it's harder. It's going to take certain scientific work on how to deal with permafrost. There are entire academies that are dedicated to that. And so the principle will work. Those areas which are barren now, in 50 years or 60 years, may be very full. And if we can advance the science, that's the way to tackle it. What I would say to you, Frank, if we can advance the science, which we haven't, but it's a wonderful question to figure out. I mean, these are the wonderful questions, because if you can figure out here, we're going to go to Mars, right? And it's going to be territory which is not very hospitable. But if we can advance the science, the principle will work. That's the best answer I can give you. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can tell you that, we're not doing anything close to what Putin's doing for Russia here in Canada. Maybe we need some of those policies here. But thank you very much for your answer. Now, if I may be greedy, I have another question, which is something...
You're absolutely right, by the way. Trudeau, look, Trudeau is such a... We used to call them yuppies. I mean, he's got nothing upstairs. He's just completely shallow. He's willing to do the bidding of anyone who asks him, so he can appear before a camera for 3 minutes. And I'm not saying the opposition is that good. There used to be real development-oriented people in Canada. I mean, people think of Canada as only was a British colony and part of the British Commonwealth. There were people who had those ideas, but it's gone down as it has in the United States. So I just add that.
I absolutely agree. I mean, most people see him as a puppet for, the globalist. He's just kind of a pretty face who repeats, what he needs to say. But, the real power is behind the scenes. As for my second question is, there's a good amount of suspicion that people have about sort of international trades, and there's this drive towards, American industry and, made locally in the country that you live in. Now, that kind of conflicts with this vision of a sort of international infrastructure and commerce and trade. And I wanted to ask, because I've also heard of this, that you want protectionism, you want to promote manufacturing in your own country, you want to promote some degree of self-sufficiency. So if every country is going to be doing mostly their own manufacturing, what is it that, you would envision that countries would be trading with each other? What kind of commerce, and how would this be different than the sort of commerce that has outsourced all the jobs, overseas to developing countries and taking away people's livelihoods?
Right. You're not looking for outsourcing. You're looking for technology transfer. In other words, what you want to export to the developing sector is packages, not just individual plants. You want to transfer entire packages. That's what the United States did to Brazil. We produced and sold, but we gave the credit for Brazil to purchase them in whole sorts of machine tool and other complexes. The idea is ultimately for every country to move them up to the ability to produce their own goods. In other words, we don't want Haiti always importing, but you just can't jump. You can't build a railroad out of wood. In other words, excuse me a second. You can't build it. You have to have a machine tool capacity. Haiti has almost none. So what you do is you have them develop for the first part of the period, with the first 5 years, cement, bricks, simple food processing, which these countries desperately need because food rots. Ports, you help them develop their own ports. But you've developed the engineering capability so that by year 7, year 8, year 10, they're starting to have the capability of building this. They may not build the most sophisticated 5-axis machine tools or laser machines, but they can build some of their own. And one of the things I proposed for Haiti was that we set up 10 workplaces with someone brought in from either Switzerland or Germany or the United States or China, which is by far the world's largest machine tool producer. And you would have a staff there of about 10 to 15 people and about 50 recruits who are youth. So that if you add them all together, these 10 places would start out to have about 500 to 550 people learning the machine tool trade. And then you step it up. You increase it. Some of them will become master tool makers and so forth. But you have to start, and you have to infuse it directly in a dirigistic way, meaning the state and the government says, this is what we want to build. This idea that you can't build anything because you're picking winners or losers. Yeah, we want to pick a winner. We want industrial development. We do not want speculation. That's part of man. Look, Prometheus. What's Prometheus? Prometheus. It means forethought. We have forethought. We have creative capacity of the mind. We don't let the markets decide, the invisible hand. We make such choices ourselves. So the thing is, if we're producing this and shipping it, we will ship certain engineers. We're going to ship farmers. So we have farmers who might calculate, and others have said they would like to go to parts of Africa to teach these things. Because what's the problem in Africa? A guy pushes a stick in the ground, and his father pushed the stick in the ground, and his father before him pushed the stick in the ground. That's not agriculture. And the person can't envisage change because no change is occurring in his or her life. We've got to ship them tractors, large tractors, 300 to 500 horsepower. We called for shipping 1,000 such tractors to Haiti. So what you're doing is you're enhancing your own internal developments. We need to build a high-speed maglev rail system, 40,000 miles of which, but you're simultaneously shipping these goods and sending some experts elsewhere. You're not shipping the jobs. In fact, through international trade, you're building the jobs. And that's what America did when it was actually growing. You see the difference? We're not shipping the jobs out so that we can get someone to work for $1.18 an hour. We're shipping technology packages and knowledge out, building up universities, building up workplaces. But we're producing in here, supplementing what we're doing. Problem which Trump had, which he had a few ideas that he had no epistemology. He didn't know what he was doing. But the problem he had is that he, did not build infrastructure. We should be putting $500 billion to $1 trillion into infrastructure projects. $200 billion, I think, into an authority to build nuclear power. Another $200 billion into the space program, rather than just nickel and diming them, and $200 billion into fusion. People keep saying fusion is 40 years away, 40 years away. Put the money in as a directive conception, and we will crack fusion. And once we have fusion, the entire economy's matrix will change. But at the same time, develop the world. We have a moral responsibility, but it so turns out that that moral responsibility coincides with an economic opportunity of immense proportions. We could be exporting 200 to 400 billion more goods per year. And when I say this, look, what did Trump do wrong about Nicaragua, El Salvador? Oh, we have migrants coming in. Fine. Build that area, which is called the Triangle, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador. Build them up, and they will become a tremendous market for American goods, and they will also solve their drug problem. And they won't have to emigrate because they're going to actually have a life.
I see your point. To industrialize the entire rest of the world is going to take a massive amount of machine tools and all sorts of advanced technologies, which of course they can't develop initially. And it would be best for the United States to provide all of these tools and to provide a tremendous amounts of very high skilled, well-paying jobs. Yeah, I see that.
And same for Germany, and same for China. Look, Germany has been suckered into saying, okay, we're going to be the point person to call for every harebrained scheme in Ukraine. What are they doing? Their energy system shutting down. They don't have food. Their farmers are being also shut down by the Green New Deal. So yes, you got the point, Frank, but you would do it for every country because the needs in Africa, if you do it, forget GDP. GDP doesn't tell you anything. In the United States, 72% of GDP is services. Where we should have it, that doesn't measure. That's why you didn't see me mention a single thing about GDP. You have to look at real productive processes, but you got the concept. And that could be done by every nation in the world. And we can crack the underdevelopment. Look, 1.7 billion people are on the verge, according to international institutions, of starvation. 9 million people died last year of starvation in the developing sector. That's 25,000 people a day. And there's no reason for that.
I agree. And right now, they have the set aside program, which is, preventing farmers from expanding agriculture to grow more food, which is completely ridiculous. There's such a need for more food in the world and more nutritious food. And yeah, it's just crazy that, people, in the West, I guess, are pushing this sort of degrowth, green agenda. It's just completely crazy. Okay.
And
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Is that, would you like to say more, Frank, or was that conclusion there?
Yeah, that's conclusion. Yeah, thank you very much, Richard.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, it's about 9:10. Richard said he'd stay with us as long as there are questions. So that was just the first couple of questions. I'm going to read a couple of questions and invite you to approach them however you like. And then I would really like to encourage people. There's been, a good 16, 17, 18, 20 people who have been listening the whole way through on Twitter. Number of people who have expressed their appreciation for this presentation on the YouTube channel. So I'd like to get people to put in their questions, and let's continue the discussion. So I'd like to begin with a question that my wife has posed. She's here with me. Can you come over here, Oscar? I want to take out the. Okay, this is Asuka.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So I was away in the first part of the presentation, so I don't know if you've addressed it. But recently, I was looking at LaRouche's four laws.
You should probably sit down.
Oh. And, we try to explain his four laws in different ways. And one of the documents that we published said we should nationalize the Fed. But in the presentation, I heard you say that you can't just go into the sort of dysfunctional system and try to fix it. So rather than nationalize the Federal Reserve, are you saying we should rather have national bank, like completely new institution? And if you can, if you can explain what the difference is exactly of the two ideas.
Sure. Oscar, I'm perfectly fine with nationalizing it. What I'm getting at, it has to be a change of policy. In other words, you have to. The Fed is a privately owned institution. It's not. It's the banks in each 12 Federal Reserve districts own the stock of the Fed, and the New York banks own the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and then there's a national board that sort of coordinates policy. But it's a private institution with a government board. What we need to do is we need to replace not just the system, but the thinking. If you think of a credit system, think of a hydrological model. I don't know if you've ever seen a hydrological model which shows water flows and so forth. Maybe people did in their earth science classes and so forth. If the system is set up in a certain direction, then the water will flow within the channels that have been set up for it to flow in. If you put a dollar into the current US system, you can be pretty sure that between 80 and 90 cents of it is going to go towards the speculative economy. It's been rigged that way. And that's the rates of return people are interested in. Therefore, you have to dislodge and rip up through bankruptcy organization that power that they have. When we put JP Morgan Chase, let me be clear on this, through bankruptcy organization, we're going to tell them, look, you're going to be 1/5 the size, 1/10 the size. You're also going to follow these policies. And that's what it means to have a dirigistic national government. It's not that the government sits back, far from it. And if you don't, goodbye. And furthermore, we want to break their power. In other words, we just don't want to break the banks up. We want to eliminate their power. We want to take the British oligarchy and the financiers of the City of London, who work. What's their worldview? What's a worldview of an oligarchy? Americans have a very difficult time conceiving this sometimes because they don't see this. An oligarchy, which has existed since Babylon, through Mesopotamia, through Venice, through Amsterdam, which was then brought into, through Venice and Amsterdam, into Britain. They see themselves as special people, and they believe that the upper 2 to 3% of the population should control everyone, and that the 97% of the population are slaves. They're helots. They're there just to be culled. You cull the herd. That's what Prince Philip said, if he could come back as a deadly virus once in every generation. That's what King Charles III literally believed. He was at one of the earliest conferences in the Earth Summit, which was held actually in Brazil. And he helped put the agenda together, that we will cull the herd and eliminate these people whose lives are not worth living. And that's the way they genuinely think. You know, people say, well, no one could be that evil. Yeah, they are. And therefore, just like they will go to war to break up Russia, and the Russia project to break up Russia has been for over 100 years. We want to take away their power, put them in jail if we need to. I'm not for shooting them or stuff like that. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have a purpose. But I am for removing them forcibly. Then if you want to keep the old Federal Reserve building, fine. You want to build a new building, fine. But what you're bringing in is a different mentality from the top, different organizing principle. We've ripped out all the old channels, like a hydrological question. We've put in new channels. The only people who are going to get credit through an international institution and through the national banks in every country are going to be those who are doing productive work. We're going to put a tax code in. Those who put in productive work will get a tax deferment, and they can get an accelerated tax credit if they bring in new manufacturing and machine tools. If they don't, they pay the same old higher rate. You shift all the policies in that direction. You put in new channels, so to speak, and you defend them ferociously. You don't give an inch on this stuff. Don't trust these people. They all gave us, mea culpa, mea culpa. I made a mistake in 2007, 2008. Now they've built a bubble that's 2.5 times larger because they have the mentality of a flea, and they only know how to do certain things in animal instincts. Man is not an animal. Man can change his behavior and change his species behavior, which, by the way, since Daniel's soliciting questions, that's not a point that Karl Marx understood. He did not. Karl Marx did not understand that. He did not understand the question of anti-entropy. And the science that he and Engels had was very, very limited. So I know some people on this call are Marxists or consider themselves leaning in direction, and I'll throw that out to tell people why. And in fact, Marx had a fixed technology conception. He was a better person than the environmentalists and the Club of Rome. But his ideas were not that much different than that of Ricardo and so forth. But in any event, we have different ideas. So that's what I'm saying to you. It's not a structural question. It's a question of policy. And what is the conceptions of man that governs that policy?
Thank you. That's great. I have a number of other questions, but I'm going to go to the first person who's actually ready to speak. And by the way, Sam and Kate, who are on the Zoom, please feel free to speak up if you like. But I hope you're available, Mr. Stryker.
Yep. Hello. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
hold on. Richard's gonna have a hard time hearing you until I hold it next to the microphone. Okay, speak again and let's see if he can hear you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, he can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. First of all, I want to say thank you to Daniel and Richard for hosting this space and taking the time out of your day to make it happen. It's been very insightful. And I just wanted to ask if you have any potential insights into where my country, Australia, should be heading, or like the direction it should be taking. Which sectors are particularly falling behind, or just any sort of insights you might have about that.
Yeah, I think, look, Australia, two things. They have tremendous tremendous development potential. You have lots of resources. You have unlimited agricultural potential. You need a rail system, like what I was showing for Haiti. You need a rail system that ties the country together. You need water irrigation systems. And I think, what's your first name, please, if I can ask?
His first name is Andrew.
Okay, Andrew, so if I can call you that. The thing, Andrew, is you need tremendous irrigation because you have places which are just not having that irrigation. Much of the cities in Australia are on the coasts, not all, but most of them are on the coast. The interior is completely underdeveloped. And that, by the way, I just want to tell you, that was what the case was in the United States too, until we started developing the Trans-Siberian, that would be great, Transcontinental Railroad across the United States. Most of the cities were built on the West Coast and the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. You have to fill in the middle of the country. I think two things about Australia, which you probably know more and better than I do. One, Australia has been asked to do the same thing that Germany is doing. Australia has been asked to join AUKUS, which is Australia, UK, United States, and form a military alliance and try and rope in Japan and police the Pacific against China. And in fact, there were supposed to be submarines sold by France, and those subs jumped the gun, and now the other Western countries are selling them. And that has led to also fights where China has said finally to Australia, we're not going to take your coal and we're not going to take some of your wool. As you know, you probably can, Andrew, tell me this better than I know. And so therefore, it's in the same downward spiral. It's in the same entropic view of Clausius, which is not science. Clausius is not science. Look, and this is what people have to develop too. And if people work with our movement, we do give science classes. There was an excellent class a few weeks ago by Jason Ross. Think of it. Just think of this objectivist thing. And I really do want to draw out this Marx thing, because Marx was a materialist objectivist. He did not study the human mind, except in a very limited fashion. He liked humans. Look, what did he do? I mean, I spent one summer reading Capital, Das Kapital, or whatever. And the first book I read, it was like, I read the first 710 pages. And all it was, and you have S, and you have C, and you have V. So now we're going to look at this mill, and there's not many spindles, and some of it goes to S, some goes to C, goes to V. And then I read to page 200. And I said, well, surely he's going to be different. And it's all S, C, and V. The problem with Marx is that he was embedded within British liberalism. Yes, he called for class struggle and dictatorship of the proletariat, but don't confuse yourself on this point. He did not have an idea of how you move from one manifold to another. What he had was an idea of what he called expanded reproduction. Simple reproduction is in a certain mold and you keep your technologies the same. But his expanded reproduction was not really expanded. It was the same technologies, just used on a broader scale. And what's the problem with that? Well, let's say I could build the greatest horse and buggy, and I could make and let's take the buggy whip. I can make it out of titanium and machine tool it to the finest precision. Is it labor time that counts? It's useless. Who needs a horse and buggy? It's from a different mode of existence. So the measure is not labor time, and the measure is not to produce more of the old thing, although we need to increase production. The measure is how do you go to higher and higher levels of technological and scientific developments, which create new manifolds for development. Do you see the difference? What Marx was doing was he was to extend the old manifold outwards, better than not letting it collapse inwards, granted. But it has no conception of how the mind works. And the point was, he didn't want to. He went into this objectivist impotence. We're going to have materialism, and there's objective laws of the universe, which are not objective anyway. Where you have to go through feudalism, and then you go through first you're hunting and gathering, and your feudalism, and then your socialism, and then your capitalism, and then your capitalism and then socialism. But that's not true. We're going to take nations in Africa. Are we going to say, well, we can't help you? You haven't gone through feudalism yet, and then you have to go through capitalism? No, we're going to go into Nigeria, and we're going to develop Nigeria, and we're going to put in maglev trains, which are more advanced than anything we have in the United States, because we don't have a single mile or only 36 miles of high-speed rail, and they're going to leapfrog us. They don't have to go through these non-existent objective bases. And that's because in economics, you have to shift. Yes, we need the maximum production. You heard me talking about it. But where does it come from? The human mind. Therefore, the education and everything else, you shift the emphasis to the human mind. If you want, you shift it from the objective to the subjective. How are you going to bring up children up? In the school system, I work in the school system for 21 years. It's atrocious. How are you going to bring them up so that they can make genuine discoveries rather than just fill in, A, B, C, or D? And they don't even have to write notes anymore. They just fill this stupid thing in. They don't think, they don't know anything about the Civil War, but they can give you a fact. Facts are not knowledge. The process of the human mind developing higher cognitive abilities is knowledge. So where Marx fails miserably, he's not a badly intentioned person, but he ends up with the same technology conceptions as those of the limits to growth, because he doesn't see that the real emphasis on the economy is the education and quality of the mind. And therefore, art, music, working on scientific principles, these are not ancillary or extracurricular activities. These are at the heart of the development of man. And then think of the opposite problem with which I brought up of Newton. Newton says space and time are absolute, which Einstein destroyed in 1905 in special relativity. So that's not true at all. But the point is, we are supposed to be scientists, put on a white coat, and then you have objective, sorry about that, you have objective things, and you go from the lower level of the abiotic, the inert, and then you go up to the level of biological. But you can't explain how you got there, because how do you get from abiotic into biology? And then you go from the biological into human cognizance, but it doesn't work that way. Animals don't have the quality of the human mind, even if they have 99.5% of the same genes. And when you read people like Oparin, who's a reflection of Soviet science, as opposed to Vernadsky, who was a genius, he says, well, at some point there was a primeval soup, and there were certain proteins in it, or there weren't proteins, there were things that could become proteins, and they were hit with lightning. That's completely idiotic. Start the other way. Instead of trying to work out with man as outside the universe and we're working upwards, work with man as the pinnacle. So if we have the cognitive principle, which has always been in the universe, even though it may have manifested itself temporarily, only in the last, say, 400 to 500,000 years, but it was always a principle of the universe. And then that man intervenes on the biosphere, the level of biology, which then intervenes on the process of the inert, because the inert changes. Why? Because there's a creative principle in the entire universe. Entropy is a fraud. It's a lie. It's taught in every damn school in America and in Canada and in France, and it's a lie. It's a brainwashing lie, and most people don't know that. Whereas what we want to do is raise children who embrace the idea of the power of the mind. and then figure out economics from that standpoint. And it's only that economics which will work. So I'm sure we have some Marx defenders. I am not a nasty guy. I will have any discussion that anyone wants to have.
Hold on, I'm sorry, Richard. I'm gonna give Andrew a chance to respond to you. I had my mute off by accident. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, that was all very good. Pretty much the only nitpick point I'll make is that it was mainly like Lenin ultimately revised that aspect of going from like feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. He ultimately didn't have that same sort of belief that you could sort of accelerate it. That's really the only thing after that. And then nitpicky point after saying that. The rest was very good.
Yeah, Andrew, I would agree with you on that. Lenin's book, What is to be Done, is a voluntaristic book. It's very voluntaristic. And he then went and said, we're going to electrify Russia, which was a very bold thing to do. And I agree with you on that aspect. His problem was proletariat culture. His problem was still that the issue was class struggle. Look, let's say you have a class struggle and you win. If you don't bring, it's very much the thing with the Sukha. If you don't bring in a different conception of man, what do you do? So we knew enough, Lenin did. And Stalin had some real problems. He did do forced industrialization, had some real horrible sides. It also had some interesting sides. But the problem was that they never got, and they took certain things from the West, which is very smart to do. And also Russia has a tremendous side to it. People don't realize this. What's the real side of Russia? Communism? No. Look, in Leibniz, who was also one of the founders of the United States, who his colleague Denis Pepin, who was French, developed a heat-powered machine, which made a tremendous revolution in everything that mankind can do. Leibniz, and we had a show on this with Bob Wesser and Chris Sayer, Leibniz went and kept seeking out Peter the Great. And he finally was able to meet him in, I think, 1714 or 1715, a year before. Leibniz dies in 1716. And he said, look, we've got to build an academy in Russia because Russia has to have science. And it also needs the arts and culture. Some of the people actually, when it was opened in 1725, which is just at the point of, so Leibniz dies 1716, Peter the Great dies in 1725, I believe the same year the academy opens. But the academy made a huge transformation on Russia. And you have a scientific tradition in Russia. Mendeleev, who develops the periodic table, which is not just, numbers or what's your valence. It was a way of conceiving all of chemistry. Who was also a railroad builder. Mendeleev built railroads. You had people like Vernadsky, who was Ukrainian, but Russian, because this idea of trying to separate Ukraine from Russia is just stupid, for the most part. I mean, there are some differences in language and there are differences in some culture, but they've been together for a very long time. So some of what developed in Russia in the 20s and 30s was not necessarily just because of Lenin. Just like today in China, the Confucian culture has a huge effect on China. You just can't attribute it to, communism. So what I'm saying to you is Lenin did do a voluntaristic view, but the problem was, even if you have a revolution, now you own everything. If you don't have the question of what we were presenting on entropy and negentropy, and if you don't have the idea of moving to higher manifolds, which is always self-perfecting. Now, is there ever perfection? Some people think, people strum harps in heaven and there's waterfalls. There is, what's perfection? Increasing self-perfection, eliminating imperfections. It never ends. And when we're sitting in an Andromeda strain, in Andromeda galaxy, we're going to have new challenges. But that's one of the beauties of life. And if at first when you discover that, you feel a little bit seasick because it's like you're on a boat. But once you embrace that, that's your identity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for participating. Much appreciated to have you there. Oops, I guess I muted everyone by accident. I have another question from someone who does not have a working microphone. This is from Aiden Stone. And he says, looking at this first graph, I believe he means the triple curve, but maybe, and you can message me if you mean something different, Aiden, but looking at this first graph, it seems like you could have made the same argument in 2012. There must be some sort of inflection point before hitting this collapse function. Yeah. What is it?
Yeah,
What is this point?
that's a very observant point. It's very good, very good. It could have been even been drawn for the period of the 1990s. I mean, again, this policy of controlled disintegration, which was started in the 1979, which is just one phase shift of a stupid plan, of a stupid idea. America's so developed. We're post-industrial. We don't need industry. We don't need this. You know, we just need psychedelic drugs and things like that. The thing is, it could have been in any one of those periods. What's the inflection? Well,
I'm sorry, hold on one moment, please. I'm having some kind of. Sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know. I was muted while you were speaking, so the people in the Twitter space didn't get to hear. Could you start over? The question was, for everyone who didn't hear it, why is this the inflection point and not 2012 or some other point for the triple curve collapse function? I'm sorry to make you repeat yourself, Richard. Go ahead.
Yeah, Aiden's perfectly right. Aiden's absolutely correct. We thought the system might collapse earlier, and LaRouche had said that too. The problem is, how does it stay alive? Well, Frank addressed this earlier. Not this one, but he really did address it. What happened? We looted other countries. Look, you go out, your living standard is falling, and it has fallen in the United States. Forget the way that they measure it. Look at the living standard in terms of your ability to reproduce a family, because a family has to be a unit that can raise children of a higher cognitive quality than the previous one, which means you have to have not only the food and housing. You can't have 3 or 4 kids living in the same bedroom. You have to have the ability to afford, you know, if you have a 3 or 4 children, afford a living space. But you may want music lessons for your child. You may want them to take an astronomy class as a thing. You may want them, you're going to be putting them through school longer. In other words, the labor force is changing. Now a labor force that be put together with modern technology really needs 20, 21, 25, not just getting a doctorate, but to have that level to the age of 25 to be capable, because as we increase the technological capabilities and scientific capabilities, you have to increase the skill levels and scientific capabilities of the labor force. Therefore, someone has to earn an income that can support that. So what's happened is, figure it out, and you can do it. Just what do you need for that? A family of 4 would need something like an $85,000 a year income. I did a little work on this, somewhere between 75 and 85. So if you earn $50,000, which some people say, hey, that's a big amount of money. It's not. And we've been losing that capability. And then the culture has been declining at the same time. So the thing is, we've looted take it as a system, as a financial system. Also, Eastern Europe has been looted by Western Europe. Factories are set up in cheap places, Albania, or poorer parts of of Slovakia or so forth. I'm not saying they were all poor. Same thing that we were doing in getting clothing produced by someone in India or Bangladesh. So if you can go into Walmart and pay $7 for a shirt, which would normally, if you paid people decently, cost $20 or $25, the shirt would be priced out of our ability, and it disguises the fallen living standards. So a lot of looting has been done, and the other side has been monetary hocus pocus. Look, since the U.S. Federal Reserve increased monetary assets, meaning printed money, by $5.5 trillion, starting in 2019. Now, this was then said it was a response to COVID, but it wasn't. What had happened was certain funds were having real problems. And what the interbank market is in the banking system is that banks lend each other money overnight. It's short-term 24-hour money. And you might earn a percent by, you lend someone money and then you return it the next day. And the Federal Reserve can set the rate on this. When banks are worried that other banks are going to fail, they will not lend through the interbank market. Like right now, no one will lend to Credit Suisse because people think this is the second largest bank in Switzerland. It's a $972 billion in assets, almost $1 trillion in assets bank. It has a lot of problems. You won't lend. And you may remember earlier I said that one of the first things that will happen is when people see this, the interbank market will freeze. That's what happened in Britain. The interbank market started freezing. The Bank of England, they got crazy Liz Truss to reverse her policy, but the Bank of England had to start doing quantity. It put $70 billion in the next day. But the pension funds can't just exit from policy investments, which were now turning sour. So they did an about face that was supposed to be tightening. The answer to your question is, I think what's going to turn it over, why now, is, we don't know exactly all that's happening. But the derivatives bubble, what I showed you before, that since 2010, the amount of indebtedness in the United States, now some of it's valid. You go out and fix a house, you borrow. But a lot of that has nothing to do with that. There's a certain level beyond which, even if you keep pumping money from the Federal Reserve, you simply can't prop it up. And I think this war in Ukraine, or the war by the West and NATO and the British intelligence and so forth against Russia, has produced a certain increased level of insanity, which may factor into it. So my answer to you is, I can't tell you. LaRouche is a forecast, not a predictor, meaning if you pass certain policies and continue those policies, they will blow up. You can't support a 1.3 quadrillion bubble. You can't do it. We don't produce enough. If you took all the bricks from your home and transferred, and everything also has to come out of the physical economy, you still couldn't do it. And so at a certain point, the tricks run out. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer for you, but I think that's in part what's happening. I saw a question, I'm sorry, about the labor force.
By all means, go ahead.
Cade, oh, sorry, if you have questions, I'm sorry, I just saw it.
No, I do want to propose though, since we still have you, that after this question, perhaps if you could go through, I did include the bar diagrams. And if you would like to do the last 4 slides, then I would invite you to, because I think that'd be valuable. But
okay.
After talking to Cade. Would you like to read it aloud, Richard, or shall I?
Okay, why don't you?
Cade says, Marx aside, is there still a role for organized labor in bringing about this new economic order?
Absolutely. Look, yes, Cade, yes, absolutely, 1000%. In fact, let me just show something. If we could show 2 of the charts, which I didn't show earlier, what will happen as a result, and it partly answers the questions that were raised earlier. Okay, now this is one, let me just use that one first, the one you just showed previously. One of the features of what's been happening to the United States is that to even physically reproduce your economy, you have to have 2.1 children per woman in childbearing age. That's usually defined as 15 to 44. Some people will say 15 to 49, although most children or young people in the age of 15 are not going to produce children. Well, we used to produce the bottom, maybe a little confusing, but it's 1960. That was a 3.7 children per woman of childbearing age. 2.1 is the level. The reason it's not just 2 is that, children die in the early age, 1 or 2 or something like that. So you want to have a little bit more than 2 children to reproduce the ones that will eventually die from old age. But look at what happened in the chart. We've been below 2 since about 1970. We went up a little bit to 2.1 children in about 2007, 2008 per woman in childbearing age. And now we're down to 1.67. Now, that's a reflection of what's happening to the labor force. The labor force, and because of the culture of pessimism, of destruction, which we in the Schiller Institute are organizing people to change, to become an active part of changing them, has so discouraged families from having children that we're producing half the children per woman in childbearing age through lack of optimism than we did in 1960. It's literally half. And they can't. That tells you the living standards are falling. Forget what they tell you. Bureau of Labor Statistics said today wages rose 3%. Look at the reality. What's happening? Now, how do we reverse that? And that's, that's the part that you who are on this call have a role to bear, because this is not a matter, it is a matter of educating, but it's a matter of also increasing the morality, which is part of what economics is. People say it's not, it is. And I saw someone said, could you call it agape economics? Yes, you could. But let's look at the next 2. This is part of a pamphlet, okay, after this. Yes. Okay, let's go back one. So what we said is in a pamphlet called The World Needs 1.5 Billion Productive New Jobs. What we said is that if we're going to do that, then we would have to make 1/2 of the labor force, get them into the productive side. Now, productive again is manufacturing, construction, mining, transportation, utilities, and so forth. And we'd have to have another 5% in R&D. And if we did that for the world, we looked at May 2020, and we said, what would that mean in the increase of the labor force? If we set this as a 25-year plan, which can be done, and it would be done for the whole world. The level of hidden unemployment in the world is huge. So if you'll look at the one for 2045, it says 25% manufacturing and 50%, that green, is productive. And that means we're going to take a lot of people who are in the non-productive side of the labor force, bankers, real estate. I don't know if you know this, but the largest category of employment in America is what's called FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. It's larger than manufacturing, it's larger than anything else. And it's setting the economy on fire. So this is the largest part. So a lot of the retail jobs could be changed. Not that you don't want retail workers. A lot of the office jobs could be changed. What we want to do is have a massive shift back into the productive labor force. And then you'll see the purple is R&D. We need massive research and development. We have all sorts of questions. For example, if we're going to tackle this permafrost question of Canada, of Russia, of China, and other places in the United States too, we need to figure out how to make fusion actually occur. There's all sorts of works in biophysics that we need to explore. So in any event, if we did that, we would re-employ, by a conscious policy of expanding the productive side of the labor force, 1.5 billion people, and we would eliminate unemployment. Now, if we can go to the United States bar, which I think is either before or after, okay, that's the United States. Oh, that was the United States.
Yeah, we were looking at the US, yeah.
My apologies. So what that would mean is right now we have about 31 million people in the productive labor force, and that's stretching. We would go up to 93 million. I told you we have 12.6 million people in the manufacturing labor force. The concept is the same, even though the graph is a little bit different for the world, but we would go up to about 25 to 26 million. And they would be better skilled than the ones that currently exist. So let's go to the world one, please, Daniel. It's just the other graph that looks like this. This is the US, yeah. We do the same for the world. Now, the world situation, you will see that the productive is even much, much lower, as you might expect. I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, they don't even have water. They have these puny little dams that were built in the 1950s and 1960s. And this is an area that used to be called the land of 1,000 lakes. They have water. They have tremendous, comes from the Kush Mountains. We have to build it. And we bombed the shit out of that place, saying we were going to try and, Osama bin Laden, when we knew that it wasn't Osama bin Laden. He was living in one part of Afghanistan. You don't have to destroy the whole country. And then we let the British NATO forces build up in the Helmand province, the huge increase of drugs. But in any event, so they're much beginning from a lower base. So that's where we would build 1.5 billion productive jobs, 1.5 billion in 25 years. If you can go back to the United States, this is where we would increase the productive labor force threefold, and we increase the manufacturing labor force 2.5-fold, and we would increase the R&D labor force by threefold. That means that 55% of our economy would be productive, and then another 15% would be health and education, and then non-productively employed, rather than being 49%, if you look at it in May of 2020, would go to 27%. And we know how to do it. We know how to do it. And the point is, it's a conjunctural crisis. You reach a point wherever, why it occurs, you reach a point, and we organize on the streets. Daniel can tell you, Oscar can tell you about it. Everyone can tell you about it. And you have people, I don't have time to talk. I got an appointment. I'm sorry, I'm going to a basketball game. It starts in 5 minutes. Oh, I'm really, really sorry. Let me see if I'm back here next Thursday. I got a skiing trip, or whatever it is. Or I've got a soap opera I've got to see. Whatever the psychosis is. I'm not saying those are bad things, but I'm just saying the American population, their minds go off into anything that's either fantasy written or whatever. Unfortunately, not all American, but you can change them. And it's periods like this where you can change them. Because when their very existence is on the line, and when all the authorities that they thought were the most genius people in the world, like the head of the Federal Reserve, turn out to be raving idiots. In fact, they always were raving idiots. And Jamie Dimon, at the head of the JP Morgan Chase, is a fool, which he always was. But they see that we're going to a nuclear war, which will destroy the world. Those periods of crisis, ideas which we have been saying for 20 or 30 years, will be listened to. We've had people, I have personally had people, oh, LaRouche, I used to think he was a crackpot. And then 2 years ago, I lost my job. And I remembered something he said about Hamilton. It works that way. People, and you have to be provocative. If you just go out and you try to be banana bland, people don't remember. But if you say something which is true, with 100% of the psychological truth, they will remember it. So we are at that juncture where millions of people can change. Don't try and look at what the Congress looks like. Right now, they don't look very good. But think of the pressure that is going to bring to the fore fundamental questions which have been buried for 20 to 30 years in the morass and the ugly culture of what passes for Western culture at this time. This is the time to do it, because everyone else is discredited. And we know what to say. We have the solution. Now, if we can go to the labor force question, let me just deal with the other one. We'll get to this in 1 second, but let's just go to this. Now, look, we'll just do something here on primary LaRouche economics. And what I'm trying to get to you is that there's an entirely different way of looking at the world. He really is a genius, though no longer alive.
Let me tell the people who are listening that looking at Twitter that you can look at the last slides in the set. The very last slide, in fact. Go ahead.
Okay, so you have a labor force, and that makes up the total economy. So you have an industrial labor force and an agrarian labor force, and they produce themselves as a family unit slightly differently. The farm is slightly different because some of the kids work at an early age, they go to school, things. So we have the part of the population that works, which is mature. That's in the middle. That's the active labor force that's usually gauged between 16 and 64 or 65. Then you have the youth who are too young to work, who you don't want working. You want them to be educated. And then you have the elder who are too young, old to work, at least in certain physical capacities, but you want to keep their minds alive. And you have the same thing for the agrarian or agricultural sector. And then you have what LaRouche called other, which is very large. It's not represented this way. But the others who are not industrially engaged and the agrarian, remember I told you that 2/3 of the American economy is what would fit into this other. It's the services. It's some useful services, as we said, essential services. But about 49% of the economy is not essential at all. So it has to be the industrial sector and the agrarian sector that produce the goods for everyone. So the industrial sector produces, and you see it manufacturing and extraction. And we took the terms, LaRouche used the terms of Marx, but he changed it. C stands for capital goods, capital formation, heavy machines, machine tools, boring machines, machines that do oil drilling, machines that manufacture doors, machines that make every variety, where man takes his ideas and technology, puts them into a machine, and makes that machine at a higher level, sort of like a synthetic form of labor. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first to discover the question of labor power, he wrote about this in the 1790s. Marx only wrote about it in the 1830s. He did not like Hamilton. He did not like Henry Carey. That's another. It's not unrelated, but that's where the original conception comes from. Because it was said it's artificial labor. Because as the power of the machine increases, the same operative with the same skill level can do today 40 or 50 times the work of someone before. Meaning you've now taken the machine which has higher scientific and technological power, higher anti-entropic power. So V stands for the labor force qualities of that industrial, what they need to consume. Because this is the input-output. The industrial and agricultural produce an output. That output, you'll see by the arrows coming around the other side, must support the labor force. So V is the portion of the productive labor force, the industrial labor force, that is needed for existence. And there you have then what's called S. Now, Marx just called this profit, but yes, it is, but it's not a profit from exploitation. It's a profit of a social surplus that man increases that because of man's anti-entropic mind. From that, you subtract D, which is overhead. And that goes, as you can see, to the other, meaning all the clothing, all the cars, all the machines and tools, all of the refrigerators must be produced by the industrial labor force. So the industrial labor force has to carry not only the weight of reproducing the industrial labor force, it must reproduce the other part of the population, which is 72% of the population. And of the total population, 49%, almost half, don't even do anything useful. The others do. But the teacher has to eat and feed his or her children. A physicist has to live. An engineer has to have these capabilities. A doctor does magnificent stuff to keep up the quality of the health of the society, but he doesn't make the machines and the other things which are necessary. So part of the surplus, if you think of it not as an exploitation that's ripped out of the hands of the workers, which some factories, some companies do that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but that's not the overall quality of it. Some of that is D, which is overhead, which has to provide for the other part. And so is agriculture. It has to feed other people. But then you have what's left over. You've now provided the capital goods of the economy, C. You provided the quality of input of goods and culture that goes back into the industrial labor force. You provided for all of those same things for the overhead. And now you have something left over. think of physics again. This is like free energy. And what you're doing is the first part is energy of the system. It maintains the system at its old level. S prime, you can see S is divided into D and S prime, is the energy for the expansion of both the scale and the qualitative, scientific, and cultural and cognitive levels of the next cycle of production. Think of each of these as a cycle of production, maybe a year. But the next cycle of production is going to be different because we have this S prime to invest. And that S prime, that free energy outside the energy of the system, will then change the entire system. And what we want is a rising level of S prime, of free energy, which is why the society is anti-entropic. In other words, machines may have waste heat. They can't avoid it. They may have frictional dissipation, they call it in physics. Can't avoid it. Okay? And for other reasons, you're never going to have a machine that's 100% efficient. It won't transfer everything into efficient work. But because the machine is not 100% efficient, what Clausius would have us believe, what all these others would have us believe, is that the society cannot be 100% efficient. But it is because it's existing on this universe as a part of the development of the universe is the human mind, which may seem to be outside this diagram, but is what drives the diagram. That's anti-entropic. It goes from a higher ability to cognize to an even higher one as it masters the processes of how Leonardo da Vinci developed sound waves, how Kepler figured out the unity of the solar system as a single system, how we figured out the principle of least action as was applied by Fermat using Schnell's equations and so forth. That is not inert and it's not biological. It's a higher thing which Vernadsky called the noosphere. Now let's go to the other one, please. This is fun. This is real fun looking at this stuff. Okay, so let's look at this. The symbol S over C plus V. So Marx would say this is the rate of profit, but the rate of profit falls because Marx says C and V get larger. Again, he didn't understand how this works. Well, I'll explain that in a second. That's a very useful thing to explain. So Lynn puts out these things. They're each a question. So we call this productivity. In other words, with certain inputs of labor force, that's V, which Cade was putting an emphasis on. Do we still have a future? You bet we have a future. And C is the entire capital goods, machine tools, and so forth, their inputs. We get an output. So if you look at material inputs and material outputs, that's just a simple ratio of productivity. Then you look at D over C plus V. Now remember, D is the quality of what we call overhead. So that's an expense ratio because you're maintaining overhead, some of which we need. We need teachers, we need doctors, we need engineers. Some of which is not. But again, what is your output for, what is your expenses for your C and V that goes in? What do you want? What has to be maintained? You do have to maintain the D, even for those who are non-productive. We're not going to kill people like that. You know, we're not the Bank for International Settlements or people like that who think that way. Or Bailey, who's the head of the Bank of England, who would kill people. I'm very serious about that. You know, Americans think of, you know, the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys wear white hats and the bad guys wear black hats. It doesn't work that way. You're dealing with the principle of oligarchy, which has existed for 2,000 years. And they don't regard most human beings as human. And once you realize that, you start to get the real enemy. The enemy is not the capitalist class. Some are terrible, some are okay. The enemy is the oligarchical principle itself. So you have this D, we have to maintain these people, but what we're going to do, as I showed you with the 1.5 billion jobs and then tripling the productive labor force in America from 31 to 94 million workers, we're going to reemploy them. C is capital intensivity, and that's very important because while you're increasing V, you want to increase the size of the labor force, you want to increase their content. You, at the same time, want to make the labor force even more capital intensive, meaning what? More machines, higher capabilities with higher productive capacities. So you want the capital goods sector to rise relative to the inputs that you need to make to maintain your industrial workforce. That industrial workforce will grow, but C will grow even faster. C is growing, both are growing. But what you want is C over V is greater than 1, or greater than or increasing, right? You want S over C plus V to be increasing. But the key you want is S prime over C plus V. And that's where you get your capital ratio, your productivity of real rate of profit. Now, this is a fascinating ratio. Why? Because each cycle of production, C should increase, V should increase, S should increase. D, you do not, well, D could increase for legitimate reasons. You want more doctors and engineers, but it should not increase for overhead waste. But S prime should increase at an even faster rate. So the rate of free energy of S prime, of anti-entropy, is greater than the other costs. Now, this also has if you get that, that's your measure of the economy. It's not GDP. It's not, can we produce more of things like, horse and buggies, but on an expanded scale, when we've already leapfrogged beyond that to a higher manifold of n dimensionalities of new technologies. But look at it this way. We're going to increase both C and V. So how can S prime increase? And this Marx failed 100%. And I'll show you why in a second. He failed it on S over C plus V. He said, Marx says, that C plus V are increasing in size, which they do if your economy is healthy. And therefore, it will cause, S won't grow as fast, and you'll have a falling rate of profit. And that's going to be the end of capitalism. What a dummy. Excuse me, but what a dummy. Does not happen. It doesn't happen. You want C and V to increase. Here's the point. Think of V, let's increase it. Because we want to increase the culture. We want to increase the violin lessons. We want to increase the leisure time. We want to increase the educational opportunities. We want to increase just the sheer standard of living so people live better. Of V. V will increase. But if we can go back to the other one, Daniel, the other graphic that you had. Okay, watch. V will increase, but the social cost of V producing it, because we will improve and lower the cost of producing clothing. We will lower the cost of producing better quality housing. It will be lower cost, but of better quality. We will lower the cost of producing all the elements that go into V, or you can call it the consumer market basket. While V increases, as we wanted to in absolute terms, as a fraction of the total labor for its production, because of the higher scientific and technological qualities, it's a lower cost to produce it. We produce more, but at a lower cost, not because of slave labor and speed up, but because we're increasing our ability through mastery of nature and of science and of machines, because we're increasing C over V, that as a social cost, it can be less of a proportion of our expenses to produce, even though it's growing in size. Now, this is called the maximum minimum problem. And these are the fun problems in math. You're maximizing the quality of V while you're minimizing its social cost as a percent of the bar diagram. And the same thing for C. Therefore, as you're also increasing the total output in each cycle, more of it goes into S prime. And S prime over C plus V increases. They're all increasing. But it costs you less socially because you've moved into a fusion economy or a matter-antimatter economy to produce the same goods as you did 3 cycles before using lower technologies. Now let's go back to S over C plus V. This still applies to the symbol S over C plus V. Marx was an idiot on this point because he didn't know physics. He really didn't. So whatever good intentions, you can have some decent intentions, and some of them weren't so decent because he didn't understand things. But some of it was good intention. He thought it's falling, S over C plus V will fall, but actually it will rise. Even S will rise because C and V should grow more intensely, but it will still produce a greater S because as a percent of the total product, mankind can increase the free energy. Now, what does that physically mean? If we do what we're doing, and I think earlier on, Frank got the concept and some others, then by developing our own economy, and developing Africa's development is to our benefit. And it's also the morally right thing to do. How do you show you love someone in Africa? How do you show true agape? Do you go and hug everyone in Africa? No. You raise their productive power so that they have the same quality of existence with no distinction as every other part of the globe within 1 to 2 generations. That is our aim. And when I said that that's morality, look, think to the future. Let's say we want to develop Mars and use the moon as a base. So we have a certain idea that we want to do that. Science will also require of us to do it because man internally is driven towards the self-perfecting process. Once you get, this becomes a quality, you don't give up. Why do people stay until 2 a.m. to complete a project? Why do labor committee members go on sometimes with 5 hours sleep? Because they're nuts? Yeah, that's probably true. But it's because it's what Kuza called the sweetness of truth. Once you taste the sweetness of truth, once you taste the sweetness of creativity, it is better than any pie or any other experience, physical or otherwise, that you can experience. Not that I don't like pie. My wife will tell you I eat too much of it and point to my midsection. But the point is, man, at a certain point, this takes over. And the need to create and discover becomes so strong that it is a self-subsisting power within you. And it brings happiness. And that's what happiness is. Happiness in the Declaration of Independence is that quality of man, once you taste your real humanity, that you can't extinguish. Once man has tasted that, it's like when Frederick Douglass said, I knew that I was free the day I could read. It's that. So the point is, S over C plus V will not fall, it will rise. If you understand the anti-entropic processes. If you don't, and you're mired in 19th century conventional mathematics as taught by the British or others, you don't see it. You have to see the invisible. And there's a great quote from Jonathan Swift, who's a satirist, and if people see Gulliver's Travel, you really have to understand what he was doing with Gulliver's Travel. He's making fun of every foible and flaw and disgusting habit of the human race, but he's putting it in a comedy, which is what a satire is. But he was also by working with Spotwood in the governor of Virginia, helping develop the American Revolution. But he writes that vision is the art of seeing the invisible, which others don't see. And that's what it is. If you have vision, you can see this. But then you have to start from the standpoint of the human mind. And if you do, then you get rising S prime over C plus V. In other words, you don't start from materialism. You start from the subjective power of the human mind, which then turns the physical economy at a greater rate than if we were all muscle-bound people pounding away with hammers and chisels. We're not. We don't want proletarian art. We want art that celebrates our creative power because it makes us more powerful than the guy who's the strongest guy. I'm not a very strong person. You can see my size here, but but you can do more than the strongest guy. I'm not saying I'm weak, but I'm just saying it's not the muscle size. You can be more productive if you begin from the process of human mind. And that's what we want to do. And that's economics. And it's not taught in American colleges or anywhere. We have to teach it. And some of those on the phone, I know Kay did an excellent show. I told him afterwards. And others of you who are on this phone should do shows and should teach classes to the youth, the other youth in this thing. Taking on a class, let me just tell you this, and Kay could speak to this, and others of you who, Frank said he gave a class. I'm sure others, Andrew and others, all of you have given classes. You must muster and be able to bring to a fine point the ideas which are percolating around in your mind, but they're not as developed as you want them to be. And ultimately, you can either give a cheapo answer, or you can struggle with something for days and try and go for the highest. And if you do, that will lead to progress, your own progress. And so I would say if we've had 20 or 25 people on this phone call, we've got 25 classes out there. And people, and think about it. You might say, I can't give a class. Think about your quality of the fact that you're human. It may be daunting. It may not be daunting. Some people are very good at classes. I'm not trying to make one way or the other. And the best types of classes is if you're in the field reaching others. You learn more about the psychology of human nature. And Daniel can tell you this up and down the line in 1 week in field organizing than you can by reading 15 volumes of Sigmund Freud, who happened to be wrong on a number of things also, but we won't go there for the moment. Because you see the resistance people put up to being human. And you start to try and think, you're not sitting there analyzing, trying to get them to move, but you think about it afterwards. That guy, the excuse they gave me was so crazy. What were they doing? And then you also learn how to mobilize other people. That's wonderful. That's a good quality. That's agapic. So you should all be there October 15th. Everyone should be there and bring 2 or 3 friends. And I'm not saying you must do it, but I think I think you should feel internally that that's the right thing to do. I'm sorry, Daniel.
No, I appreciate that comment very much, and I agree with it. I think this is a good place to conclude, because you've made a very effective call to people to take up their own humanity, and this is the idea of the conference. There's a major strategic, political, everything shift happening in the world right now because of this collapsing system and because of the emergence of a new one. And we have to create new leadership today that doesn't yet exist in order to steer humanity in the right direction, and emphatically to get the United States and the collective West, as Putin would put it, out of its satanic habits. And that's the plan from the conference, is to spark this kind of process on a higher level that will then be a continuing process. We're going to have more conferences. We're going to continue to grow every single time, and not merely in number, but in quality of conception. So thank you very much, Richard, for the class that you've given and the very extended amount of time that you've been able to provide for this kind of conversation. Any last comments?
I enjoyed it, and thank you for having me. And I would just say, and I think Daniel is experienced enough in this. This is what life is about. It really is. Why are you on this earth? if you can do this and you can spend your time doing this and you willfully choose to do this too, and you can save other human beings in the world, that's what life is. Think about something that could be better than that. I know.
Okay, well, I think we'll say good night. Well, so thank you again.
Thank
Take
you for
care,
having me.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.